The tea had been cold for an hour. Admiral Tessin Orev had not touched it. The mug sat between her and the debrief officer across the table, a man who had not yet spoken, and the cold did not seem to matter to either of them. The mug was gray, slightly chipped at the left rim. The founding year of the outpost it came from was stamped into the ceramic in raised lettering worn almost smooth from years of handling. She had never washed that side. The folder on the table said confirmed casualties, 2.3 million. She had not opened it. That was the wrong thing. A person receiving a casualty report opens it. You sit down, you open the folder, you begin reading. She hadn't done that. She had set the folder beside the mug and left it there, closed, because she had already read every name inside it, in the order they were listed, which was alphabetical, which meant she had read children first. The debrief officer's pen was on the table. He hadn't picked it up yet. They called us unregistered, she said. She did not look at the folder when she said it. Then they opened fire. No warning, no declaration, no mercy. The Kelvari Accord's expansion fleet entered the castle corridor on a Tuesday, which was an arbitrary detail except that a Tuesday was when the market at Farron Station ran its longest hours. The winter market. Blue-white lights strung along the docking ring. Her chief of fleet coordination's brother had worked the docking registry there for 11 years. He was 42. He had a sister who kept a hollow still of his face on her console at a classified way station in the outer Tethys system, and he did not know that, because no one at way station Orath Kellen was allowed to tell the people they loved where they worked. Humanity had filed 14 formal diplomatic objections over 9 days. On day 10, a single transmission arrived on open galactic frequency, audible to every species council within range. Humanity is an unregistered species. Unregistered species hold no territorial claims under Galactic Conclave Article 9. The Accord acts within its authority. Then the fleet opened fire on Farron Station. 2.3 million people, 11 minutes. At the emergency conclave session that followed, Director Elias Vin, Director of Human Diplomatic Affairs, 63 years old, gray at the temples, the kind of man who kept a handkerchief folded in the same pocket every day of his adult life, sat in a chair that had been placed 40 centimeters below every other delegation's seat. The conclave hall was built to Kelvari proportions. The ceilings vaulted in ways that made the air feel thinner to smaller species. High Arbiter Sorvin D. Hall stood at the elevated center dais, a position the Kelvari delegation had held for 90 years through a procedural claim no one had successfully challenged, and read from a citation scroll in a language that required real-time translation for most of the species present. Van poured himself a glass of water from the carafe in front of him. Not because he was thirsty, because it was something to do with his hands that looked like nothing. He listened to the translation. He set the glass down. He wrote 3 words on a notepad in front of him, folded it once along the horizontal, and passed it to his aide. The aide went pale. The debrief officer had finally picked up his pen. He held it without writing. What did the note say? He asked. Admiral Orev picked up the cold mug and held it in both hands. The ceramic was room temperature now, no warmer than the table, no warmer than her hands. She rolled it slowly, the way she always did in the pauses between sentences. I'll get to that, she said. She set it back down. First, I need you to understand how long the answer to that question actually is. 37 years before that folder landed on that table, there was grain dust. That was the first thing you noticed when you arrived at way station Orath Kellen, the smell of it. The station had been an agricultural processing hub before it was converted, and the smell didn't entirely go away. Grain dust and the particular warm yeast smell of bread baking. The bread was Dr. Sova Andareth's theoretical physics, weapons architecture, the quietest person on a 6-person team, and someone who baked every Sunday without fail, partly because it was Sunday and partly because, as she explained once to no one in particular, the equation stopped moving forward when she stopped feeding people. The station looked like nothing because it was supposed to. It sat at the edge of the outer Tethys system, 3 transit hours from the nearest compact shipping lane, listed in navigation records as Decommissioned Agricultural Processing Unit, ORATH null sector. The docking code still registered grain shipments that had stopped 40 years ago. If you queried the station's energy signature, you got exactly what an abandoned processing unit should produce. Baseline life support cycling and the faint residual heat of equipment no one had bothered to shut down properly. What you did not get, what no long-range scan had ever found, was Operation GREYWHCH. The codename had been issued 37 years ago, following humanity's 3rd formal rejection from Galactic Conclave membership, the Tethys Compact exclusion. There was no public vote. There was no recorded transmission on any channel that could be retrieved. There was a directive issued by exactly 3 people, received by exactly 3 people, and never written down in recoverable form. Codename GRYWTCH. Purpose to be determined by events that had not yet happened. 6 people ran it. Not as a command structure. Command structures have meetings. Greywatch had a grain dust smell, a coffee machine that broke every 3rd week, and 6 human beings who had quietly agreed, in the way you agree to something you know you will spend the rest of your life doing, that the work mattered more than what the work cost. Admiral Tessin Orev was the strategic lead. She was left-handed. She had reviewed deployment maps by tracing routes with her left index finger rather than marking them, so nothing could be backtracked if the station was ever found. She spoke in declarative sentences. In 37 years of operational briefings, she had never once used the word if. Not because she was certain of outcomes, because if was the kind of word that gave people permission to stop working. Dr. Sova Andarth ran theoretical physics and weapons architecture. She was small, quiet, and had the particular focus of someone who had spent so long working on problems that couldn't be shared with anyone outside one room that she had simply stopped performing urgency for an outside audience. She solved her most significant equation, the one that made the fleet positioning viable, on a flour-dusted notepad on a Sunday morning in year 19. She did not realize the flour was there until the solution was already complete. She wiped the notepad off and went to pull the bread from the oven, in that order. Commander Haven Reese handled tactical planning and fleet coordination. He kept a hollow still of Farron Station's winter market on his console. His brother had worked the docking registry there for 11 years. Reese referred to every ship in the fleet by individual registration number, never by class or collective. When the team asked him why, he said it kept the math honest. No one asked him to explain that further. Lieutenant Sen Orvar ran intelligence and signals. She spoke 9 alien languages. She had a habit, harmless, unchosen, of responding to questions in whatever language she had been thinking in when the question arrived, then correcting herself mid-sentence. Bethai Strand forward coverage is complete Gomen, coverage confirmed at 94%. Nobody on the team had ever minded. In 9 languages, she had spent 37 years listening to a galaxy that did not know it was being heard. Ambassador Sale Verne handled the diplomatic and legal architecture. She had drafted the dissolution mechanism before Farron Station burned. That was important. She had drafted it before the wound, not in response to it. She had been refining it against every known counter-procedure the Accord had ever used for 12 years by the time the fleet was deployed. The summary of that document, 71 pages, condensed, she carried in her left coat pocket. It was worn at the fold. Her right hand moved toward that pocket when stakes were at their highest, a tell so small and so consistent that only the people who had shared a grain dust room with her for decades would recognize it. She had never explained the habit, and no one had ever asked. Engineer Davin Mosseth handled infrastructure and deployment. He was quiet in a way that was different from Andarth's quiet. Andarth was quiet because she was thinking. Mosseth was quiet because he had already thought, and the thinking part was done, and now he was just doing the work. He carried a small book in his chest pocket, human navigation poetry, the kind written by pilots who had never expected to come home. He had never explained it when asked. He didn't stop carrying it. 6 people. And behind them, invisible cold, scattered across 23 dead star systems that no shipping lane touched, 4,847 warships. Every Calvari relay beacon mapped, every resupply corridor logged, every transit window for every Accord patrol route measured and recorded across 19 years of data. The fleet had been built quietly, registered under 14 different provisional defense charters across the last 3 decades, and positioned into dormancy at sites chosen by Mosseth's deployment calculations, and a set of dead system coordinates that had come, years later, from a species that didn't know yet why it had been giving them. The fleet had been cold and waiting for 19 years before Farron Station burned. Orev had built the strategy, Andarth had built the math, Reese had built the fleet, Verne had built the exit. Mosseth had built everything that held the rest of it up. Greywatch had been running, Admiral Orev told the debrief officer, longer than the Accord's current lead arbiter had held office. She picked up the cold mug again, held it. The team outlasted 3 conclave administrations, 2 galactic recessions, 1 attempted infiltration of our signals array that got within 11 meters of our outer relay before Orevar spoofed it into querying a grain storage manifest from 40 years ago. She set the mug down. We fixed the same coffee machine 214 times. The debrief officer wrote something. He stopped. He looked at her. The coffee machine. It broke every 3rd week, she said. One of the resistance coil junctions. We had the replacement part manufactured by a station in the Vel system that thought it was servicing agricultural equipment. A pause. The people who fixed it were running the largest covert military operation in human history. The coffee machine was the only thing they ever let themselves be annoyed about out loud. She did not smile when she said this. but the debrief officer understood that this was as close as she was going to get. The wound came the way wounds always come. Not during a moment of preparation, not during a briefing, not at a time when the people who would have to carry it were in a position to choose how they received it. Reese was at his console when the alert came through. He had named the ship that picked up the signal, Registry 4119, ECS Vigil Outer Castle Monitor Post, before the transmission was even fully decoded. The signal was 2 seconds of compression-encoded emergency burst. Oravar unfolded it in 4 seconds. It contained everything in the way that 2 seconds can contain everything. She said his name, Haven. He turned. He looked at what was on her screen. He turned back to his console. He pulled up the hollow still of the winter market, blue-white lights, docking ring, the particular brightness of the market on its longest day. He looked at it for 11 seconds. Then he opened the fleet status log and began updating the dormancy rotation schedule for the next quarter. He referred to every ship by its registration number. He always referred to every ship by its registration number. He kept the math honest. Orav had been asleep when it happened. She found out standing in the corridor outside her room, in the clothes she had slept in, with Andareth in front of her holding a single printed sheet. Andareth had not baked that Sunday. She had been awake since the signal arrived, and she had not baked, and that was how Orav knew before she read the sheet, that whatever it said was the kind of news that stopped things that had never stopped before. 2.3 million people, 11 minutes. She read it, she folded the sheet once horizontally. She went back into her room, she came back out holding the mug. "Call the session," she said. Andareth said, "Which one?" "The emergency conclave session." "Pull the feed." "Tessin, it's happening now, Director Van is." "I know, pull the feed." She watched Director Van pour a glass of water in a chair 40 centimeters below everyone else in the room. She watched him write 3 words. She watched his aide go pale. She did not know yet what the 3 words were, but she watched Van's face, the stillness of it, the way he held the glass without drinking, and she understood that a man who had spent 9 years watching the Accord move toward something it had not yet done had just seen that thing done. She picked up her pen. She wrote "Activate Phase 1. The note that Van's aide had gone pale at. 3 words folded once. It had taken 6 days to reach Waystation Orath Kellen through channels that did not officially exist. Oravar decoded it in her usual way, in the language she was thinking in when it arrived, then correcting herself. She held the decoded output for 3 seconds longer than she normally held anything. Then she handed it to Orav. "Wake the shepherd." The shepherd had been asleep for 19 years. Fleet activation across 23 dead systems was not a loud thing. It was the opposite of loud. It was the sound of dormant drives cycling up in empty space, with no one to hear them, at a rate calculated so that no single system's energy signature would spike above the background noise threshold of the Accord's long-range relay network. It took 68 hours. 68 hours for 4,847 warships to go from cold to ready, in 23 systems scattered across 3 sectors, without a single vessel breaking a single monitoring threshold. Mosseth had built the activation schedule. He had built it in year 6 of the operation, updated it 9 times across 31 years of relay network changes, and stress-tested it against the most current Accord monitoring protocols available 9 months before Farron Station burned. It held all 23 systems, all 4,847 ships, full activation in 68 hours without a single alert. The shepherd was awake. While the fleet activated, while the 68-hour clock ran in the background of every conversation at Waystation Orath Kellen, while Andareth baked bread again because the equations were moving again and that meant the bread was necessary, Ambassador Sale Verne made 9 phone calls. Not to Major Powers. Not to the species with the largest fleets or the most conclave votes or the oldest diplomatic relationships with humanity. She called the ones the Accord had been shrinking for a century. None of them were powerful, none of them were safe, all of them had kept records. The Emrithari were archivists. Their homeworld had produced scholars the way other planets produced crops, steadily, generously, in quantities that outlasted whoever had planted them. Individual Emrithari lifespans ran to 140 years. They read other species' histories as a primary research practice, not a courtesy. Elder Thesavara was 140 years old, 4-armed, and had spent 30 of those years reading human history. She had read about the records kept at Nuremberg. She had read about a species that, after the worst thing that had ever been done to it, had spent years building the document that said this is what happened, and what happened will not be allowed to happen again. She had found that interesting. The Accord had stripped 2 Emrithari star systems in a procedural reclassification in 2203. A technicality, they called it. The Emrithari called it something that did not translate well but which meant approximately the removal of a word from a sentence in order to change what the sentence means. When Vern's call came through, Thesivara was in her archive. The connection opened. Vern said, "Elder Thesivara, I believe you know why I'm calling." 11 seconds of silence. Then, "We have been waiting to see if anyone would finally mean it." A pause. "We commit 14 ships and my testimony." She said it the way someone says a sentence they have been holding for a very long time and are only now setting down. The Davari Collective did not need the full summary. Ambassador Vern had prepared for a long call. She had prepared for questions, for hesitation, for the careful consensus building that the Davari were known for, a people who made no decision without the full weight of their collective behind it, who moved slowly and once moved did not stop. The connection opened. Vern began the summary. She was 4 minutes in, not finished, not close to finished, when the response came. 9 ships committed. She had not yet told them about the fleet. The Davari representative's gill stripe was dim on the feed, the pale blue-green gone gray, the way it went when a Davari was carrying something too large to metabolize quickly. The Accord had reclassified the Davari Collective as a provisional species in 2198, a legal category that stripped voting rights in any compact body. Left military service obligations intact. The Davari had been paying dues to an institution that did not acknowledge their right to exist for 28 years. 9 ships, the representative said. We committed them before you called. We simply needed someone to call. The Kelfareth took longer not because they were uncertain, but because their representative needed a moment to understand something. They had lost relay rights in 2198, the same session that had reclassified the Davari. 1 Accord session, 2 species reduced, 30 seconds of procedural language that had taken both of them decades to rebuild around. For 40 years after that session, the Kelfareth had done what their culture demanded. They mapped. 6-limbed, narrow, built for the long patience of navigational work, they had charted dead systems, dormant stars, empty corridors, space that no shipping lane touched because there was nothing there worth the fuel to reach. They had given Vern those coordinates 18 months ago. 40 years of dead system mapping, shared as a gesture of good faith, offered because the Kelfareth kept records the way other species kept children, carefully, with the understanding that what you preserved outlasted you. On this call, Vern told them what the coordinates had been used for. Silence. Not the silence of hesitation, the silence of someone doing arithmetic. You put the fleet there, the Kelfareth navigator said. Every dormant position, Vern said. Your maps made the positioning possible. We could not have done it without them. Another silence, shorter. 7 ships, the navigator said, and the full coordinate archive, anything we've mapped in the last decade that we haven't sent you yet. The Marani assembly required 4 minutes. Under normal circumstances, the Marani required 6 months for any commitment of this weight, full internal deliberation, collective vote, consensus ratification. They were a stout, triple-jointed people who spoke in overlapping pairs, every sentence a conversation with itself, every decision the result of a process so thorough it was almost geological. Vern had understood this 18 months ago. She had pre-briefed the Marani Council observer during the Farron Station inquiry, a sealed summary delivered in person with 1 sentence attached. If I call, this is what I am asking. The observer had not responded then. He had taken the summary. He had gone home. When Vern's call came through, the observer said, "We convened 3 days ago. We have been ready since Tuesday." 11 ships, committed before she finished saying thank you. 5 more calls after that. Each one shorter than the one before. Each species smaller than the last, in the way that species who have been reduced tend to get smaller over time, not in physical stature but in the space the galaxy allows them to occupy. 61 ships total, none of them powerful on their own. 9 species, each with a specific wrong done to them in a specific Accord session with a specific procedural citation number that Ambassador Vern had in the 4,700-page document she had been carrying, condensed, folded, worn at the crease in her left coat pocket for 9 years. They had not been asked to fight. They had been asked to be present and to have their records entered. That was Vern's design. She had understood something 37 years earlier when she first drafted the mechanism. The most powerful thing a group of dismissed species could do was refuse to be dismissed while the vote was being counted. The 68-hour clock hit 0. Conclave Anchorage Verath Dihur was built for a specific kind of politics. The ceilings were high, Kelvari high, which meant they were built to make non-Kelvari feel the height as something other than architecture. The session floor was technically level, as the charter required. The elevated center dais had been held by the Kelvari delegation for 90 years through a procedural claim filed in year 1 of the Accord's membership and never successfully challenged. Because the challenge mechanism required a supermajority vote from a body, the Accord had enough influence to block. The chamber seated 38 species. Most of them had been in this room before and knew what it felt like to be in it. A few of them had been in this room before and knew what it felt like to not be acknowledged when you arrived. High Arbiter Sorvin D. Hall was already at the elevated dais when the session opened. He was 8.5 feet tall. His skin was copper oxide scaled, shifting between green and brown under the session lights in the particular way that orthmine coloring shifted under stress. Though Sorvin D. Hall had not shown stress in a session chamber in 14 years, and he did not show it now. His four-fingered hands were flat on the surface in front of him. He did not gesture. The citation rod, carved bone resin, 60 centimeters, a formal instrument of the Accord, rested to his right. He tapped it once on the dais before speaking. He had done this 44 times. He had come here today to do it a 45th time. The grounds, humanity's permanent reclassification as a non-signatory entity under Galactic Conclave Article 9, pending formal dissolution of all claimed territorial designations. He had the citation scroll, he had the procedural authority, he had 44 precedents and 90 years of institutional weight behind him. He began to read. He had never, in 44 previous proceedings, needed to pause. What Sorvin D. Hall did not know, what no one in that chamber knew except the human delegation and 61 ships worth of coalition crews, was that at 400 conclave standard, the Shepherd had moved. Not fast, not dark. Every transponder active, every ship broadcasting species of origin, registration number, and current heading on open galactic frequency. The fleet had moved with all its lights on, the way you move when you want to be counted, not hidden. 4,847 warships, 61 coalition vessels. They had positioned simultaneously, not sequentially, simultaneously around all 7 Kelvari Accord relay stations in the galaxy. Not inside the station's defense perimeters, not with weapons powered, simply present. Each fleet group holding position at the exact distance Mosseth's deployment calculations had identified as visible on every standard monitoring feed, without triggering automated defense protocols. The Accord's relay monitoring network was built to catch stealth. It had algorithms for hidden signatures, suppressed transponders, masked energy outputs. It had been built by engineers who had spent 90 years assuming that any threat would try not to be seen. It had no protocol for a fleet that wanted to be seen. The network detected them all at once across all 7 stations and generated an alert level it did not have a category for. The alert sat in the system for 4 seconds while the network searched for a matching response procedure. It did not find one. Inside the chamber, Sorvin D. Hall continued reading. His voice carried the particular evenness of someone who had been doing the same thing for long enough that the doing of it had become a kind of architecture, reliable, load-bearing, automatic. He read the citation language. He cited the articles. He named the precedents, each one in the order they had occurred. He had not checked the relay feed. He had no reason to check the relay feed. He was in a session chamber. He was performing a procedure he had performed 44 times. The outcome was not in question. Ambassador Sailvern rose from her seat. The human delegation's platform was 40 centimeters below every other seat in the chamber. It had been 40 centimeters below for 90 years, since Director Van's visit, since the emergency session, since the Accord had made sure that the species it had just reduced knew, at every subsequent meeting, exactly how far below they sat. Vern stood up from 40 centimeters below everyone in the room. She straightened the document on the intake surface before placing it, both hands, one small adjustment, the way you handle something you have carried for a long time and are finally, at this specific moment, putting down. 4,700 pages landed on the intake surface with a sound that was not loud but was very clear. Sorvin D. Hall stopped reading. He looked at the document. Vern said 2 words into the open channel. Article 14. The session feed updated across every monitoring screen in the chamber at the same moment. All 7 relay stations, all 7, each one ringed with fleet signatures, human and coalition both, transponders active, positions locked. The feed showed registration numbers, it showed species of origin markers, it showed 61 vessels from 9 species that the Accord had been reducing for a century, sitting in plain sight around the infrastructure the Accord needed to function. A document, a legal mechanism, the end of 90 years. Article 14 of the Galactic Conclave Charter was the mechanism for emergency dissolution review of any member body found to have operated outside its founding mandate. It had existed in the Charter for 90 years. No one had successfully invoked it. because the documentation requirement had been considered impossible to meet against a body with the Accord's legal resources. The documentation requirement specified evidence of violation, co-signature from a minimum of 6 compact member species, quorum present. The 4,700 pages contained 23 species, 14 illegal annexations, 61 documented instances of procedural manipulation, the full sensor record of Farron station's last 11 minutes, the testimony of every species in the coalition. The dissolution mechanism itself, stress-tested 1,400 times across 12 years against every known Accord counter-procedure, and folded once at the crease where Vern had carried it in her coat pocket for 9 years. It had held every time. Elder Thesivara rose. She was 140 years old. She had 4 arms and eyes built for archive work and a voice that had spent a century in rooms full of records. She was the oldest person in the chamber. She had been waiting in one form or another for this moment for 30 of those years. She spoke one sentence in conclave open record. We have been waiting to see if anyone would finally mean it. A breath. The record shows they did. Zorvindihal set down his citation rod. Not deliberately, not as a gesture. It was the motion of someone whose hands had stopped working with the rest of them, a small disconnection between intent and action. On the session feed, every delegation watching saw simultaneously all 7 relay stations. Silent, ringed, present. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He sat down. That was the whole sentence. The vote ran for 19 minutes. 31 in favor, 4 opposed, all Accord aligned, all species that had benefited from 90 years of Accord hegemony and understood exactly what they were voting against. 3 abstentions from species that would not commit either direction and would spend the next decade explaining why. The Marani bloc cast the votes that made abstention mathematically irrelevant. 11 ships worth of deliberation, 6 months compressed into a 3-day convening, committed before Vern had finished saying thank you. The dissolution mechanism processed. 17 minutes. The Kelvari Accord as a governing body, as a legal entity, as the structure that had operated without a successful challenge for 90 years because no one had ever been patient enough to make the record complete, ceased to exist before the session closed. Sorvindihal's citation rod was logged as a surrendered institutional instrument at 14:32 Conclave Standard Time. No planet had been bombed, no civilian had died. The fleet had held position for 68 hours and had not fired a single shot. Admiral RF gave the return order at 14:43 Conclave Standard. The fleet had been holding position for 11 minutes since the vote closed, not by accident. She had set the hold duration herself the night before when she wrote it into the return protocol with no explanation attached. 11 minutes was the length of Farron station's last morning. She gave the order in a declarative sentence. She did not use the word finally. The session clerk asked Commander Reese if he had any additions to the record before the file closed. A standard question, procedural, the kind of thing that got asked at the end of every session and almost always got the same answer, which was no. Reese said yes. The chamber emptied slowly. Coalition delegates stayed in their seats longer than anyone else, not from ceremony. Some of them had not been in a conclave session where they were addressed as full members before and were not entirely certain the procedural moment had closed. Not because they doubted the vote, but because things that have been a certain way for a very long time take longer to stop feeling that way than they take to legally stop. Reese stood at the delegation surface. He had a printed sheet in front of him. He had printed it himself at way station Orathkellen on the morning of departure. The print quality wasn't perfect. The station's printer had always been slightly off on its ink distribution, a quirk no one had bothered to fix because fixing it had never seemed like the most important thing. He began to read. Names. In alphabetical order because that was the order they were listed in the casualty record, and Reese had decided without telling anyone that the session record would use the same order, which meant children first. Which meant the first names read into the conclave's permanent record were the names of people who had been at the market that morning because it was the winter market, and it ran its longest hours on Tuesdays, and some of them had never been to the market before because they had just arrived on the station. He read for 41 minutes. The chamber was silent for every name. The session clerk did not close the file until he finished. Operation Greywatch closed officially at 19:00 Conclave Standard. Its files, all 37 years of them, were declassified and sent to every compact member species before midnight, not as a record of what humanity had done, as a record of how it had been done. The difference was Vern's, a distinction she had insisted on in the declassification language with the same precision she applied to everything else. The files included the deployment schematics, the legal architecture, the 12 years of stress testing, the 9 calls, the 40 years of Kelfareth coordinates, the coalition contact logs, the sensor data, the dissolution mechanism with every version number and every counter procedure it had been tested against. They also included Dr. Andoreth's bread recipes, and her flour-dusted equation notepad, the one from year 19, with the solution written in a different pressure than the flour, the one that had made the fleet positioning possible. Mosseth's navigation poetry book was photographed and included as an appendix. He had not known they were going to do that. He found out when the files went public. He did not say anything about it, but he did not look unhappy. The annexed territories began transferring to neutral administration within 72 hours, as the dissolution mechanism's automatic provisions required. Senior Accord arbiters were placed under interstellar hold pending conclave tribunal. The Accord's relay network, without an operating body to maintain it, was offered to the Kelfareth under provisional charter, whose navigational infrastructure it had been built to replace. They accepted without ceremony. The Orath-Kellen station was formally decommissioned. The decommissioning record noted that it had operated as an agricultural processing unit. No one corrected it. Admiral Orev wrote one entry in her Greywatch closeout record. She wrote it unsealed because it was meant to be read. It went into the declassified files with everything else. Humanity is not patient because we are gentle. We are patient because we learned early that a case built correctly does not need the room to agree with it while it is being built. It only needs the room to be present when it is finished. She closed the record. She picked up the mug. The debrief officer had stopped writing somewhere around the 41st minute of names. He had not started again. The pen was on the table. He had not picked it back up. The note, Orev said. You asked what the note said. Yes, he said. Wake the shepherd. She turned the mug in her hands. That was the whole note. A pause. 3 words. Director Van wrote them in a room where he was sitting 40 centimeters lower than everyone else while the Accord read out the legal justification for 2.3 million deaths. He poured a glass of water. He wrote 3 words. He folded the paper and passed it to an aide who went pale, because the aide knew what those 3 words meant. She set the mug on the table. Stamp side up. For the first time since the morning of the Farron Station strike, she set it down stamp side up. The outpost's founding year was pressed into the ceramic and lettering worn almost smooth from years of her thumb running across it in the pauses between sentences, in the quiet moments between orders, in the long spaces of 37 years of work in a room that smelled of grain dust and bread. Almost unreadable. She could still read it.